My name is Jason Hughes. I'm a critical care paramedic with the Wales Air Ambulance. Previous to this role, I was a paramedic with the Wales Air Ambulance, where I'd worked for about 15 years. I suppose it's difficult to quantify the exact amount. What I do know is that we had regular sort of contact with people that were homeless. They're obviously part of a population that have certain needs. Some of them are sometimes recalled because of concerned bystanders that obviously see these people unsure if they're well. They've probably got a bit of a reluctance to approach them, so they call 999. We are called alongside police services to sort of reports of a person not moving in a doorway or in an alleyway, and the ambulance service goes as part of an initial response. I think, you know, the homeless community, if you like, have got a number of things that they are sort of a part of the consequence of what they of how they live, and so they're exposed to the elements. So we sometimes get called for patients that are cold and wet, particularly if the weather's been significantly poor and there's been inclement weather, long periods of snow or frost, and obviously they get potential hypothermia. And similarly in the summer months, you know, they get hyperthermia, which is obviously the other end of the extreme, where they can become quite dehydrated. There is a sort of a section of the homeless community that have a addiction to drugs and to alcohol, which, you know, if they've taken too much or they've had or, you know, they've sort of taken a drug that they're unfamiliar with, they can have an adverse reaction, so we get called to those. Obviously they're not really eating that well, they don't see the doctors that often, their sort of exposure to the environment's in a personal hygiene, so they're more prone to infections. So we have had obviously calls to patients that are just generally unwell and on the streets and obviously not registered with doctors. I know there are outreach support teams that sort of try to promote health and hygiene, and they sort of capture a lot of that. But from an emergency perspective, if that infection isn't treated or if they have become significantly unwell, then obviously the ambulance services are called to support that. From a community perspective, I think, you know, it's about trying to sort of understand what the root cause of homelessness is, and that's probably bigger than a community can deal with. But you know, a lot of these patients, if you like, have their own journey to homelessness, and some of it's as a consequence of abuse, some of it's as a consequence of post-traumatic stress, some of it's as a consequence of running away from something else. Sometimes it's just circumstantial, something's happened in their lives and they've lost their house there, you know, and then they've just become on the streets, and obviously the result of that, it's difficult to then get employment if you haven't got a sort of residential address. So I suppose community employment, sort of trying to sort of overlook the fact that some of these may not have a residential address, but also about an awareness of the roles that we all have in this, in that, you know, we should be looking after each other, we should be looking after our own families and trying to sort of prevent that escalation. So if you are seeing someone deteriorating, you know, from a mental health perspective, trying to access healthcare early, if you see people with a sort of addiction, trying to sort of access what's available, and if people are exposed to traumatic events or things in their lives that potentially could put them onto a path of, you know, mental health or drug or alcohol addiction, to try and promote accessibility to these support groups as early as possible. I wouldn't say it's a threat. I mean, at paramedics, you go to the call that is presenting at that time. I think there's a as you say, there's been an increased sort of a definite palpable increase in homelessness throughout the whole of Wales, Swansea in particular. I think it's at the end of a line. Obviously there's been documentaries that have sort of highlighted why some of the homeless people come to Swansea. I think there was other sort of factors that have drawn people to maybe the accessibility of drugs. Again, it's not a nice sort of tag to be burdened with, but I think there has been a recent uprising in numbers. I think that will have an impact, of course, upon the demands on every single emergency service, and the ambulance service isn't isolated in that regard. And I think there is a need to try and develop systems and processes to support those that need help the most.